Hey, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, but I'm excited to kind of show you from Portugal. This is actually Lisbon in the port of Portugal, just sitting right out here and right from my balcony. And hoping to really give us a good time to talk about some really important things, certainly if you're running projects. And believe it or not, guess who's with me here? Lori's here. So here we are to cover kind of our second part of our webinar series. And Lori and I are going to go through this together with you guys today. All right. So what to do when your project starts to fail, part two, dealing a little bit with what we call our risk management, part of how to ensure your projects are rescued, right? If you can actually keep it from failing, that's always a good thing, but we're going to talk about some pieces. First off, as we get started, I think all of you guys know from Advisicon, we're very happy to dig into our project management series. Been doing this a long time, both using our tools and our process, but more appropriately is I want to make sure we understand the importance of using good principles in project management. We'll do a quick recap on some of the things we talked about that are the human side of project management, and then we're going to dig right into key steps for rescuing projects, especially if you're noticing your projects are kind of slipping off, or if they actually have already slipped off, or maybe you're inheriting something that's gone completely off the rails. What do you do and how do you handle that? I'm Tim Runcie, been doing this for 30 some odd years, just a passion of mine for sure, and lots of teaching and coaching. Lori with me today, a doctorate and PhD in organizational psychology, and definitely has run her own set of PMOs, and very happy to have her with me today. As we get going, let's talk a little bit about what happened in projects and what happened with your project, especially if it's gone off the rails. So one of the things we have to understand is that there is a cost or a price point for a project, not just the material anguish for people who are wrestling through the fact that they are struggling to deliver a project, but also the fact that there are statistical impacts that are out there, including that projects fail. 70% of projects fail. And of course, they experience difficulties. In fact, that's the idea of a project, is you're trying to, in many cases, do something you haven't done before. Laura, did you want to call out anything here that really stands out for you for some of the key factors that really talk about when projects fail, what the impacts are?
No, just accept that when we look at some of the impacts of project failure, we look at budget most of the time, because that is either a reason for or a direct result of a project just going south on you. And so it may affect schedule, but budget is what matters in most cases.
Yeah, and if you think about the size of the project, the larger the budget, the larger the size, cost, effort, the higher the risk factor. In fact, that bottom one talks about IT tech projects, but that is not exclusive to just IT tech projects, is that they have a higher likelihood of failure. And of course, the idea is that you definitely want to maintain some good controls as you go through managing your projects. So some of the common things that cause projects to fail. We've seen, I don't know, I've seen lots of things that make things fail, but I like especially having written a book on requirements gathering. And I think that's just a real important part, is that before and as you engage in a project, you need to have clear objectives. If your people don't understand it, how are they going to understand what they need to do? I think it's a real important area there. Lori, there's many of them here. Which ones have maybe bitten you, or you've had to help rescue folks when they've been working on?
All of them, to be honest. I think the important point to understand here is that you can do absolutely everything right. And it's the things you can't control, maybe poor leadership above you or above the project level, or lack of resources that you may not directly control. But you can do everything right and still have some of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly being an executive and in a leadership position, I have worn many hats, both as a doer and a leader. And the more engagement, the more trust that you build with your leadership, meaning that you're coming to them, letting them know what you need help with, is a wonderful thing to actually put in place. But if you have poor leadership, even at the project manager level, or maybe as an analyst, or you have a technical team who just isn't guiding or leading the team, you have a lot of areas that come up and can actually siphon people away, or they get distracted. So planning is important. I mean, I love schedules. That's why I was a project MVP for 20 some odd years. And now it's morphed into other types of scheduling and productivity tools. But I think really the idea is that even if you might have thin resources or even a lack of resources, you can overcome some of that by doing proper planning or timing it well or negotiating with that leadership group about when you need people and when you can release them. In fact, you can get pretty creative around that. And without doing that, people self-level. Like if they're over-allocated, they'll pick and choose what they're going to work on.
Right. Absolutely.
They may not even work on something that, usually is, what is it, the loudest fire? Or
Right. Yeah.
whoever's screaming the loudest. So in many cases, these are things that we want to take a look at. And again, I'm sure you probably have your own, but when we think about looking at the big rocks in the stream, sometimes, as Lori said, you can do it all right and you're still going to have problems. So when a project starts to kind of slip away, or you can feel it kind of ebbing and flowing, or perhaps you can see that the plane is already in a nosedive and you're suddenly thrust into the cockpit to pick it up and see if you can avert that, what can you actually do? Lori, anything that you would maybe emphasize some from your experience?
Yes, as with many things in life, the first step is recognizing that you have a problem. So can you identify that a project is failing early enough on so that you can actually have time to think of a plan or to think of a mitigation strategy or quit and update your resume, whatever you need to do. Can you do that with time enough to give yourself time to think and get the project back on track, or get yourself and your team back on track?
Yeah, again, sometimes it is, especially for technical projects, people are doing things they've never done before. One of the areas Advisicon's working on right now, in fact, the last year and a half, we've been focused on how to begin using AI inside of both scheduling technology and running PMOs or projects. And it's not like it's a high technical thing, but it is a change. So if you've never done it before, there's always that risk factor. Mm-hmm. So if you haven't done risk planning, sat down and just had a brainstorming session and said, here's all the risk factors or things that we can do, it's always a great place to start. If you're in the middle of your project and you're going to have to start, you could probably be doing some very quick root cause analysis, meaning that you can even discuss what is happening in terms of, or what's happening, what's the biggest impacts. And sometimes you have to prioritize where you're going to spend time. And that might mean negotiating scope, schedule, budget, kind of reorienting about what you're going to do. And that's important. If you have any of that, getting a handle on it is also involving your team and helping to think through how they're going to solve that. So it's not just push it off on one side of the organization or another. It's like everybody rolls together, and it is hard. It's sometimes when things are basically, if the boat's sinking, you want to spend enough time with your folks trying to understand, maybe we can prioritize. Is there another way to do this? Can we think outside the box? And if not, maybe we can run some suggestions to your leadership or senior management, perhaps to buy more time, or perhaps maybe you are going to have to spend more than your original budget around what's being done. But again, that's that communication piece. And again, if you're failing to get your projects, there's some things that you can tackle and certainly work with that fall right back into straight project management 101. So last session we did kind of a recap, and I wanted to make sure we touched some of those key points because they do flow into what you can do around the project management piece. Lori, we had talked about a lot of the cultural part of just the impacts to people when a project's failing. So maybe just recap the top parts here for cultural impacts.
A project can get off on the right foot or get off on the wrong foot if you have the right kind or the wrong kind of politics and stakeholders with different agendas. That can make all the difference. So, and again, those are things that sometimes you as a project manager or a program manager can't control. But if you're aware of them, then you can hopefully plan around them, and you don't put people that don't work well together on the same task or anything like that. That's what I would think is probably the most important, is know your leadership in terms of the stakeholders and know what the politics are, because there's politics everywhere.
There certainly is. And, even some of the requirements that you had started out with, a lot of times the customer might be changing their mind. Or if you're working in an agile manner, sometimes it's, hey, maybe that's not where we need to go. And you need to be able to have some of that change control that says, you know what, this is what we planned, but really this is what we actually need. And so being iterative, that is helpful. But it is common, especially if you do have changes, that you really want to communicate those with your stakeholders. And so thinking about the upstream and the downstream impacts, those who are going to receive receive the work from the project versus just the folks that might be either funding it, is that you want to have a high level of that communication. And even with your team, when things aren't going well, it doesn't just fall to that project manager to be the only person carrying that burden. You really want to engage in that. And that led back to some of the strategies we talked about in session 1, which was how to kind of set the stage so that you could communicate, get the help that you need, but not be overburdened necessarily with, people trying to micromanage you. So again, I would say certainly technical parameters change. Things happen, especially like you said, if you've never done it before. So if we think about this going forward, what are some key steps for rescuing your project? Let's just drill right into that specifically. So when a project faces challenges, of course, if your team members are engaged, it is a little bit demoralizing. In fact, the idea is that, as Lori said, the first step of the Alcoholics Anonymous or AA or whatever you're in, NARCOM, the whole idea is that you recognize you have a problem. And, one of the things that in a teaching organization like Advisicon, we actually teach people to learn from your mistakes. So sometimes if you stepped on a landmine and you did it accidentally, you talk about how that doesn't happen before, but you recognize it and then you begin digging into it. You want to kind of let that grieving process go behind you, but use that knowledge of, hey, remember last time when that happened and I said this and we didn't get this done, or I failed to deliver this specific code to you specifically, or we didn't test it out more properly. Let's not have that again. And so we use those learning pieces to go forward to help make sure we can deliver. Some of the steps that are going to guide you and your team, certainly in keeping your project moving forward, I will always go back and I will toot the trumpet of requirements. If you have improper requirements, you are going to miss the ball every time. If you magically come through with some sort of deliverable, but you've missed even one stakeholder and they aren't happy or they didn't get involved, there's an impact to that. And so it's important to definitely follow the process of making sure that you've identified all of your stakeholders before you just jump in and start doing requirements. And of course, as you think about people who are giving you requirements, sometimes in their mind, they already have a solution. Try and get people to not think about a solution, but really to unpack what is the actual requirement that we need to do. You can ask that question why 5 times, or a lot of times we'll say, what a value does that give you? And you keep asking so that people, when they begin telling you what they're looking for, sometimes you have to mock it up or build it. And then it may be or may not be exactly what they're thinking about. And so there's this whole iterative process of unpacking what that is before you get to it. But again, I want to make sure we lean in on requirements. Another one is that if you don't have a project management process, and I don't mean you have to have a complicated project management process. In this screenshot that you can see here, this is one that we use with a lot of organizations that are working through low maturity. And so will it mimic some of the project management life cycle, or as you can start seeing in Prince 2 or other areas where they have strong phases and stages? This just says we start, and this is when we start a project, and then we organize and prepare, and then we do the work, and then we end the project. So if you don't have a process, it doesn't matter sometimes what tool you use, a process or low process maturity is something that you want to start with beginning to put in place, including the more complicated your project is, you may have to defer to a little bit more of a system or a software development lifecycle. But the idea that this iteration of trying to define, document, plan, and then begin to build, test, and deploy all falls back up to that initiate, planning, and execute and controlling. But having a process, if you don't and your project is slipping, that's one of the first places I would go back to, is even if you haven't seen project management, jump right to it. Lori, let's talk a little bit about root cause and, of course, project goals that may have to be reevaluated.
Sure. I mean, always the first step is to understand, as Tim said with requirements, what is the problem we're trying to solve initially as your project. And then as your project develops problems, figure out where they began. Like, is it a lack of requirements, or is it a lack of clarity about the requirements? Interestingly enough, I think PMI says that out of all the project failures, greater than 95% of them are due to failure to properly understand, identify, and document requirements. So, it's a big part of a project. So understanding what the problem in your project has stemmed from is probably key to getting yourself back on track. But definitely talk with your team members, because sometimes they see things you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And because they may be doing the work in a different way than you are. And it's always good to get their take on, what do you think went wrong?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what did we do here? How did we get here?
We've done plenty of root cause analysis, especially even with technical teams. We have junior and senior members. And it's interesting doing a retrospective to go, when did you think this was going off the rails? And sometimes the junior resources know exactly where they can pinpoint where it is. And so having the team involved in that root cause analysis, or be able to say, hey, listen, let me push the button, let me stop the production line because we've got a problem here, we have a defect, is a matter of building trust. And that's part, especially if you've formed a new team, sometimes it takes time to actually create that trust, that bond, versus the blame storming that happens when something goes wrong. So I think that whole idea is engaging your team to do that root cause analysis. And I'm going to talk about a tool here in a moment that we're going to make available to you guys for free if you guys want to send us a contact information. But again, identify that. And then again, validate the assumptions, validate those requirements. Lori, I think we've called it out here as reassess project goals.
It may be that you have a goal for the project that just isn't reachable. It's just not feasible for the resources that you have, for the time that you have, any of that. And sometimes that's a hard thing to really come to understand and then to vocalize to your stakeholders. But you may need to do that. What are we trying to accomplish here? And given this new set of circumstances, what can we accomplish here? And as you know, sometimes are the hardest steps to take.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, you know, being a consultant and working with a consulting organization and many other consulting organizations, one of the things that we found is that, you know, consultants are paid to talk about the elephant in the room, right? And as a project manager, you are paid to talk about the elephant in the room, right? You actually have to kind of tackle that. And so it is hard to basically take the emotion out of the equation. But if the circumstances, if the resources or the assumptions that you made suddenly start falling apart, which goes back to risk management, which is, do we have a contingency plan? Do we actually have a mitigation plan? Or we thought this thing would happen. It didn't. Here's the impact of the project and what we need to do. You have to be willing to take the emotion out of that equation and talk through that. And that's a really hard thing to do. But when you actually do that, kind of like riding a roller coaster, you can hang on really tight and your stomach's in your throat the whole way. And then at some point when you let go and just put your hands up and it looks terrifying, it actually, you're like, oh, this isn't so bad. But taking the emotion out of it is like, when you can do that, it's really a freeing feeling and essentially allows you to begin to dig in on those solutions that we've been talking about. Of course, communication, as you know, product manager is all about communication, both clear lines of communication up and down. Having regular communication or using a communication matrix that says, this is an inbound, this is how I want to be communicated with, and having an outbound communication matrix talking about the ability to say, I'm going to communicate to these stakeholders in this manner. And so that way they know exactly when and how they'll be communicated. And they've also had a chance to weigh in on that. But it's a public document. It helps you kind of communicate that. And if your project is starting to go off the rails, it's not just your project team that may suffer. It is all the stakeholders. So engaging them in that conversation allows you to begin to fold many more people in to help you solve that problem. And again, keeping those updates on how you're doing is about building that trust. Sometimes you lose your resources.
Or you never have them.
Or you never had them to begin with. They were promised to you. Go ahead, Lori.
No, you got it just right. You either lose them to other projects or resources that you thought you would have available for your project just aren't there. And they're the ones that are going to be doing the work. You're directing the traffic and they're doing the work. And that's a hard one to get behind. That's where your communication plan comes into effect, where you can elevate and escalate that need.
And sometimes you have to call out if somebody's not able to do the job, you'll have to get what you need to get the job done. And sometimes that's a hard conversation, could have hierarchy. You might have somebody who's better or worse, or somebody who just isn't capable of doing. But basically, the idea of using personnel, budget, and different tools, you may have to reallocate your resources. And sometimes this is just for the good of the company or the agency, the organization, and of course for your project. And so having that conversation, if the team is engaged, typically technical teams, I found really well, they can take, put their heart on their sleeve. In some cases, they are still about making sure that something will happen and they want to be part of that success. So having that conversation, making those changes is something the sooner you can do it if you're finding it's failing. And the way to see that is if you look at estimates. I'm going to get this done in 3 days, and in 3 days it never gets done. It's always twice the amount of time. Or if you've got a budget in your schedule of hours and time and that schedule's constantly slipping, then either your team is poor at estimating or there's something else going on. Maybe they're not qualified or capable, and you may need to do some team shuffling to make sure you can begin to adjust that. Project plans, always in flux. That's one of the reasons you can spend a lot of time planning out your project, but the minute you start, it starts to really kind of unfold. It's kind of like riding a bucking bronc. It's going to go where it needs to go. And all you can do is try and steer, guide, and hang on.
Absolutely.
But you absolutely should be making updates and looking at what's happening. Hey, I noticed there's a trend here. You're going to hear more about what's called the project manager agent that's going to be coming out by Microsoft. Microsoft's building an AI agent to help people do a much better job at finding problems or looking at things like this. And so these are all cool and exciting things, but those analytics you can do right from your own schedule. Laura, talk a little bit about engaging stakeholders, because I think sometimes, as a PM, you can get yanked. And if you really do have a handle on it, you don't want to be yanked. But at the same time, that's where the stakeholders come in. And there's plenty of things you could do to rescue your project, or at least help get it across the finish line with their help.
Yeah, especially when a project goes wrong, when things start to go wrong in your project, human nature is not to talk about it. Human nature is to kind of try to keep it to yourself, fix the problem. Maybe they won't notice. Do whatever you can behind the scenes to do that. Don't do that. That is not going to help you. Engage your stakeholder, especially if you have a project advocate on your side in the stakeholder group that you have. Often that's your funder of the project themselves, because they have an investment in making sure that it succeeds. But involve them, let them know what the problem is, let them know what your thought about mitigating the problem is, because no one just wants to have a problem dumped on them. And make sure they're behind that decision, because they'll be the best project advocate, and they'll be the best advocate for you as a project manager.
One of the things I was wrestling with another project and had another firm that they actually, in their billings, they actually spell out how much time they put in and how much they actually charge and didn't charge. In a lot of cases, people kind of sweep things under the table going, I put a lot more time into this, or I spent a whole weekend trying to get this thing done. And people don't realize the cost of effort. And I don't just mean sharing it with the customer. Whether you want to be that transparent that says, we're billing you 10 hours and it took us 20. I think transparency is good and certainly kind of communicating that. But more appropriately is having your team communicate that. So your stakeholders certainly may want to know about downstream impacts or upstream impacts, but I try and have everybody participate in that communication, which is, hey, here's what it really took to get there. Do we need to revise our estimates? Or maybe we need to revise our projection, and then communicate that with our stakeholders if we need more help or a better skill set. But I try to make them part of the solution, as well as even if the customers have flexibility. Sometimes they don't, but the idea is that you want to engage everyone as a stakeholder. Quick wins. Wow, this gets back to if you've really been slogging through a project and your team's morale is low and they've been pushing the weekends and the holidays, is break these things down into small wins. I think that's one of the things that people get excited about, is that excitement breeds excitement. So absolutely lean into quick wins. Even if you have to break apart 3 parts of a delivery, even though this one delivery milestone might be what be on the schedule, break it into the successful pieces. People love to see that they're gaining forward momentum. Lori, any thoughts on the obviously monitoring progress closely is just part of what a PM should be doing. Otherwise, you're going to be surprised at the very end. But quick wins. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, make your category very broad. Make your benchmark low enough so that you can reach it. It may not be an exact project milestone, but if your team is kind of in a rut around a project that isn't going so well, give all of us a reason to smile. Say, yeah, we got this one.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's just we we're only 5 days late. We're not 10 days late.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm really stretching it here for quick wins, but psychologically, it's really important
Mm-hmm.
that people feel like they are managing themselves out of a hole, and that's what we want in these projects, and we want to get the project back on track. So that kind of goes along with the replanning that you're doing, the rebaselining, so that you can create a schedule that hopefully you can make.
Yeah. What's the great again? Microsoft Project Schedule or a Planner Schedule or a Primavera? Get a schedule. If you want to do it in Excel, just look at what your baseline is. Here's what we said we do on the dates. And then how did we actually do against that? Mm-hmm. And watching that. Scheduling technology will actually progress and check and move things out in the future. So that way, when you begin using that schedule, which a lot of people build a schedule and then they never go back and progress it, they can't see how much things are slipping. And so that's the idea of having deadlines and having a dynamic schedule, move forward and backwards, showing you your ahead or behind, and then you can anticipate the problems that might be needing to be done or what you could do to fast track things. So in terms of steps of best practices, things that we get to, those tools and techniques, basically when it's important for you to target those issues, target an issue plan or a risk plan. Sometimes the immediate thing we do is we stop, we get everybody to pause, we replan the project, we rebaseline it, we take a look at that. We have to communicate with our stakeholders. And so there are many tools that you can use. Remember, a tool isn't just technology. A tool is a process. A tool could be like I said, some of those flow charts, but use a tool to help your team begin to get back into the momentum. I remember, Lori, when I was working with you at the city of Portland, one of the project management organizations, they would kind of celebrate their successes publicly. Mm-hmm. And it was a tool to help people kind of galvanize around maybe my area might be struggling, but other areas are doing okay. And so, again, sometimes you have to look at, using a process or a set of tools or at least a way to communicate, to gather that team around. And whether it's a risk management tool, which I've got oodles of risk management, mm-hmm. bubble charts, or a root cause analysis, or you have communication tools, you're going to find a lot of tools that really, if you're not using them, whether they're paper or they're electronic, or they happen to be a Word document, or you're using an Excel spreadsheet or a project schedule, use your tools to communicate with your stakeholders. This actually eliminates a lot of the heavy lifting that may happen. Mm-hmm. Lori, we spend all our times in and around technology. Any call outs there on just tools or techniques?
You don't have to have anything fancy. You don't even have to have software. Mm-hmm. If you have a couple of pads of Post-its, that can work too. I think the main point here is that you're documenting it somehow and you're making it visual so that your team, especially if your team is with you mm-hmm. and not remote, can see that. Not only that you're slipping, but that you're actually making progress. That's really important.
Yeah.
Too. So you can get very fancy and have these great tools, and they are great, these software tools, but you can also go very old school and very basic and low tech and have Post-its or legal pads or whatever you need to do, as long as you have it written down and you can share it with somebody.
Yeah, if you're going to use Post-it notes, I recommend getting the extra sticky Post-it notes. You do not know how many times we've had to sit down and brainstorm and lay the whole flow chart down, the ERDs, everything was there, or we'd have this predecessor successor relationships, and then the Post-it notes would eventually fall off the board. Oops. So if you're not writing it down, make sure you get something that will at least keep it in place. But again, people do need to see sometimes visually that progress. I'm showing you right now an Excel risk root cause analysis tool. And for anyone watching this video, if you want to send us an email and ask for this, we're happy to send it to you. Normally, this is like one of the $20 tools. We've got a whole bunch of them out there around project management, risk management. But this is a root cause analysis tool that will actually chart and graph and help you prioritize some of the root cause issues. And so sometimes there's a lot of noise that you want to take the emotion out of the equation and narrow that down. And so working through a little bit of electronic tool to help your team kind of brainstorm, focus on the big important things is very helpful. And again, using this in communication. So if you'd like that, send us a note. Happy to send this over to you. Like I said at the top here, use tools, avoid blame storming. Mm-hmm. We want people to quickly recognize the problem, but then focus on that solution. And sometimes in that, if you bring in a project manager on a project rescue, they're not there to make friends. They're not there to win, influence people. They really want to get this fixed. And so it is almost a hatchet job as they come in. But interesting enough, they go back to the basics. What didn't we do? We didn't have a communication plan. We didn't have a risk plan. They go back and they literally will follow project management best practices and fast track that. And again, reassess those goals. So as you think about that, you might be also consider working agilely. Here I'm showing you kind of a planner board where you've got these tasks and costs and they can roll back to a Gantt chart. But the idea is that whether you're doing sprint planning or you're doing buckets where you drag and move things from one team to another, sometimes the idea is finding something that's just enough for your team to communicate. And whether you decide to use Planner or other tools that are out there, there's a lot in this space that will help you keep track of it very simply. And again, whether it's leading to a full-blown schedule or not, again, depends on your view and of course how much information you want to keep track of. I like to see full schedules. I like dependencies, but sometimes it's much better to flip to a board view or a grid view and let people filter and find what they're working on and progress that. But again, it's helping to tell the story. And again, multiple tasks managed much easily versus trying to manually type it down, or if you are moving Post-it notes. Lori and I probably go back when we used yarn and corkboard and 3x4 with
whatever
push pins.
Whatever works.
Exactly. So anyway. And even if you have some of these tools, again, this is a dashboard showing risks and issues. If you put them in SharePoint, if you have standard places that you're drawing from, you can have some dynamic reports that look to simple information that tells that story. And so people can kind of see where it is, what needs to be worked on. And again, showing that portfolio of key initiatives or deliverables is helpful if you're running a project management organization. But tactically, whether you're running a company or running a project, you really go through a lot of the same processes of rating, ranking, prioritizing, shuffling resources around to make sure that you get to good results. And sometimes in trial and error, you may have to put something on hold or just saying this requirement's going to have to move later. We're going to have to focus on other things so that we can get to ROI for our customer. So, Lori, best practices you want to call out?
Just know that all is not lost. When you recognize that there's a problem, it's really easy yourself to get demoralized and think about, where did I go wrong? What did I do wrong? Do I have the right team? All of that might be true or not true. And there may be things that you can't control. The important part is to recognize when you're falling off a cliff and then embrace it and move on. Like, okay, how do we go forward? Unless you have something that's very disruptive, like you have no resources. That's a disruptive factor. You can't do a project without resources. Or you have a particular resource that's causing problems for whatever reason. Then it kind of doesn't matter. Understand what the problem is and then move on. And really look for forward progress because it's so easy to kind of get in the doldrums when things don't go well.
I think that's good in terms of certainly calling that out. Again, I think one of the points here, it says leveraging lessons learned regularly. I think that's a big win in terms of the idea of what's going wrong. Your team can tell you what's going wrong.
And they will.
They will, especially if you wait to the end of the project, then it's not such a happy conversation. But iterative learning, quick wins, even if it's a weekly sprint or a weekly huddle or a bi-weekly, but definitely begin to say, hey, we're learning from our mistakes, but I want to leverage lessons learned and then have your team begin thinking about solutioning around that, right? The idea is that how do we repeat that or how do we not repeat that? This is what worked well. this is not what worked well. So if I'm looking for things that say, hey, I want to improve what we're doing well and de-emphasize or completely push out of our perspective anything that has not worked well, we really want the team to be engaged in that. And again, it is a much better feeling, especially as you do it as a group. Everyone is pulling and pushing. You're not just a project manager doing it alone. And that's the idea, is that we win as a team, we might fail as a team, but at least we're going to communicate that with our stakeholders.
I think also that there in software development in particular, there's this phrase fail fast. Mm-hmm. And I think for project managers, an alternative to that is win quickly. Mm-hmm. And that's making sure that you set milestones that are reachable, even if they aren't major milestones in your project, that you have internal milestones for your team that you can reach, that you can show progress, that mm-hmm. you can keep people engaged and feeling good about what they're doing, because that is a big part of it.
Yeah, quick wins, fail early, fail fast, right? So if it's going to break today. Like don't wait till you're 6 months into a project to figure out something. Lean into it. And I think that's the idea, is that you can really kind of galvanize people around what's working well and even avoid some of the pain. Even if in a project rescue, you find that people have probably done all the wrong things and they haven't talked about it. So again, going back to the basics, I think that'll be helpful. So in summary, obviously, when good projects go bad, no matter what you do, projects can go wrong. Lori said it well. Be prepared. You have to work certainly nimbly, agilely, and that doesn't just mean how you're scheduling, but be really communicating and adjusting as you go through. It says, remember people, not tools, deliver projects. I think that's really important, both to your team members as well to your executives. Again, it's back to that, people are what actually is engaged in delivering. You could have the best AI tool, but miss the fact that you didn't talk to a stakeholder or got a requirement wrong and literally drive that bus right off the cliff and do so with a big smile on your face and everybody rooting and cheering along because you're not communicating or you missed something. So again, that's the idea. It's not about a tool. It is through people. And remember, this isn't just one project. You want to be able to consistently deliver over time. Lori, anything else you want to emphasize on here?
I think adjusting expectations as you go along, especially if you hit bumps in the road. And again, having a strategy for how to get to that new expectation is so important, especially when talking to your stakeholders. So, just being very upfront and very clear and saying, okay, this was our goal. We didn't quite make it, but here's how we're going to get back on track, or here's how we can make up some ground, or here's how we're going to crash the schedule and make the schedule behave, the way it needs to. So just be prepared to adjust expectations, because no project plan survives first contact with the enemy. It always changes. So
it does. Well, again, I'm Tim the Tool Man. I love tools, but I will tell you, absolutely, you want to be engaged with your stakeholders and your teams. You want to be communicating, and you want to identify these problems early on. But if not, start today. What is it? The best time to plant a tree is 25 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is tomorrow or today, right? Get it done. So in thinking through this, just wanted to tell everyone, thank you. Again, I hope this is helpful. Advisicon, we love to share. And from, looks like night now, we started this right at, we thought sunset, but thanks for watching. And from Portugal, this is Tim and Lori signing off. Talk to you soon. Bye now.
Bye-bye.